Good evening and welcome to tonight's event, a discussion about populism and the EU with our two distinguished speakers, Frank Furedi and Gisela Stuart. My name is Munira Mirza and I'll be chairing tonight's discussion. The event is organised by the group Invoke Democracy Now, which was formed in the aftermath of the EU referendum last year. And it's one of a series of public events that's been organised to look at the political implications raised after that vote and some of the questions raised about our democracy. Both our speakers tonight are people I have known and admired for many years and have had the pleasure of working with. They both have a reputation for being outspoken. Interestingly, for tonight's event, they both come from the political left. They are deeply European by virtue of their countries of origin. And they are also, I think it's fair to say, deeply Eurosceptic. And I think that just goes to show that there is no contradiction between any of those positions. And in fact, perhaps because of their experiences and their careers, they have been unafraid to question the EU and some of the claims that it makes about itself. So to give you a little bit more of an introduction to both of them, Frank Furedi is Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent. He has authored 17 books, ranging from topics as diverse as parenting, British imperialism, the politics of fear, education and authority. He also writes regularly for the media, although he's just told me he might do less, because it's very distracting. And he is recognised not only as a leading academic in the field of sociology, but as one of Britain's leading public intellectuals. Tonight's event has been inspired by Frank's latest book, Populism and the European Culture Wars, the Conflict of Values Between Hungary and the EU. It's a fascinating account of the values that have defined the history of the EU project and how those values have brought it into conflict at times with some of its newest members from Eastern Europe. At a time when there's much discussion, anxious discussion in the media about populism, I think this book takes a very interesting angle by looking at anti-populism and how that in itself might be a greater threat to our democracy. Speaking after Frank and in response will be Gisela Stuart, who was the Labour MP for Birmingham Edgbaston for 20 years until she stepped down last year and formally retired, although she seems as busy as ever, I must say. She was born in West Germany and came to live in the UK in 1974. Whilst an MP, she served as Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Health, and she was a UK parliamentary representative to the European Convention, which was tasked with writing the European Constitution. And this was a crucial moment for her when she, I believe, developed her Euroscepticism. And crucially for us, she also, in that role, pushed for an exit clause, which would then become Article 50. So we have a huge amount to be grateful for, I would say. I think as chair, I'm allowed to have an opinion on Brexit. I will have one anyway. And as most of you will know, she, of course, played a very prominent role in the official Vote Leave campaign during the EU referendum as the chair of that organisation. And she now chairs its successor organisation, Change Britain, which campaigns for a successful Brexit. Gisela also chaired a cross-party inquiry for the think tank British Future into the legal status of EU citizens after that vote. Frank is going to speak for about 10 minutes about his book, and then Gisela will follow on and respond. We'll have a conversation here. So now my pleasure to hand over to Frank.
Thanks very much, Munira. This was a book I didn't really want to write because I was involved with a number of other projects. But what happened was that last year I kept going back and forth between Hungary and England. I spent a year in Hungary doing some research on developments in Central Europe. And in the course of going back and forth, I noticed that I was getting increasingly frustrated and irritated, both by the unfolding of the debate on Brexit and the kind of fairly arrogant, paternalistic assumptions that were being made about normal people who are very often denounced as being illiterate and not able to deal with complex issues, not really the kind of people you want to consult on an important matter of the state, such as the leaving of Europe. And I find that anti-democratic impulse extremely difficult to handle, having been brought up on a fairly robust democratic tradition towards popular sovereignty. In Hungary, I was particularly interested and also worried by the way that Hungary was being represented in the Western media. And if you were to read the Western newspapers, you would think that Hungary is really Germany, sort of just the day before Kristallnacht. And that it's only a matter of time before these terrible people, the terrible government, is going to sort of lead to a world which is not unlike that of Nazi Germany. Now, I'm as somebody who's not really conservative and fairly open-minded and tolerant, I've got a lot of issues with the Hungarian government. They're not exactly God's gift to liberal enlightenment in the way that I would see it. But all the things that they were being criticized for, I saw as being not any different than what goes on within the European context. They were being criticized for their media laws, which I consider to be liberal. I believe in free speech, and I'm in many respects a free speech absolutist. And I don't believe in any laws that censor anybody in society. So naturally, I'm against that in Hungary. But then the Hungarian media laws are really no worse or no better than the many horrible media laws we have in England, France. The European Union's own media law is pretty sort of censorious in many, many respects. They have introduced a whole range of restrictions, from hate crimes to the way that kind of religious dissent is being policed. So there is a double standard there. And similarly, Hungary's sort of kind of being criticized for building a fence between Yugoslavia and Hungary. But of course, when in England we don't let people in from Calais, that's cool, that's all right. It doesn't have the same kind of meaning. Or when the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, build a fence between themselves and Russia, not a murmur of criticism in that kind of respect. And in general, you'll find that there is a profound sense of double standard. And even anti-Semitism, which is always raised, you would imagine that Budapest is just full of brown shirts, sort of going around, sort of beating up Jewish people. I thought it was very, very interesting. I was talking to a rabbi in Budapest who made the point to me that the really weird thing about anti-Semitism is that we got it here in Budapest, but actually, as a Jew, you feel anti-Semitism much more immediately, much more tangibly when you go to Brussels and when you go to Paris and even in London. So the idea that somehow there is a qualitative difference in the level of these kind of sentiments, I think is weird. So that's what kind of motivated me. And in particular, in the course of doing research on this, I drew the conclusion that it was really important to turn the tables around. And instead of being defensive about populism, which is really a swear word used to describe the opinions of people that the elite doesn't like, it's much better to say that the real problem that we face in the 21st century is anti-populism. It's the fact that there is an anti-populist assumption, an anti-populist consensus among our cultural elites, which never describes itself in those kinds of terms, but actually has a real double standard as to what kind of people are allowed to play a role within public life, and who are anti-populist because they recognize that millions of ordinary people throughout Europe do not share their values, do not share their values about some of the most fundamental aspects of human life, and therefore they understand that if these views gain traction, as they did in Brexit, they will create a very major problem for the European Union. So standing up for popular sovereignty is the first sort of task that I set to deal with in the book. The second issue, and this is something that surprised me because I didn't know I was going to write about this, is the importance of national sovereignty. I never actually thought that national sovereignty was that important. I just kind of took it for granted. We have nations, but maybe one day we'll have, like, as Immanuel Kant said, a world government, and that might be a really nice thing. But then as I looked at this more and more, I realized that actually national sovereignty is the precondition for the exercise of popular sovereignty. National sovereignty is a precondition for creating a condition where you can hold people to account, where democracy has got any meaning. We live in a world where people's identities as political citizens cannot exist beyond the boundaries of a nation state. The idea that it's an abstract global citizenship might sound good at tea parties in Brussels, but in the real world, all that it would mean is that technocrats and experts and political operatives are more or less ruling the world on our behalf. So I think that national sovereignty is very, very important. And when I looked at the EU, I realized I thought was really quite interesting, is that Europe changed, the European Union changed fundamentally from its beginnings. In the beginning, I think on balance, I think the EEC, the old European Economic Community, was not a bad thing. I think economic union, I'm quite relaxed with and quite happy. But as you go along and you get to the European Union, you get to the constitutional discussions that occurred, a fundamental change seeped into the way that the European Union worked. And it was basically this. Initially, the European project was about recognizing that Europe represents a diversity of nations. It was very much a union of different nations. And the idea of there being different cultures and different traditions, different ways of looking at things, was more or less recognized, even by the more committed, the more zealous proponents of European Union. If you look at the European Union today, what's interesting about the European Union and its value and its approach is that its central value is diversity. It loves diversity. You know, it's for the diversity of regions. So if you're a small region in Spain, you know, the European Union will love you. It likes the diversity of identities. Anybody that moves is given an identity, and that's okay. You know, sort of, and it continually promotes and celebrates all kinds of identities. But the one diversity it doesn't like and rejected is the diversity of nations. In fact, all of its values are about denationalizing the nation, denationalizing people's values, both by promoting the regions, giving them greater and greater authority and they're being celebrated, and also at the same time by valuing the European Union. So the poor old nation gets squeezed in between the diversity of minorities, which is good, and this super state that exists within the confines of Brussels. And I think that that's a really important problem for us, because it's not that, you know, one wants to be a nationalist politician who goes to the extreme, but we have to recognize that people like ourselves or most normal human beings have a modicum of national consciousness. National pride is not necessarily a bad thing. And if we basically stigmatize that, as has become the case, we run into trouble. And one of the most disturbing developments that happened in the last few years is that the idea of national sensibility has been turned into a moral crime by the politicians in Brussels. If you hear Juncker or Barroso and all these Euro bureaucrats, they always make the point that you begin with nationalism and you blink your eyes and you at the xenophobic end, which then leads to Nazi Germany and all the rest of that. So there's a sense in which the traditions and the values of the nation have become targeted in a way that is, I find extremely uncomfortable. One interesting thing, I don't want to go on and on, but that I kind of began to realize is that when you read the statements that are being made, and particularly when you talk to some of the European sort of bureaucrats or operatives in Brussels, they do operate like a non-imperial empire. And in fact, some of the speeches that Barroso made, I think he made the point that we are the first sort of oppressive empire. And there's a kind of imperial ambition that exists within Europe, which explains why it is that any nation that dissents from the Brussels consensus will immediately get pathologized. I think that's what happened in Hungary, and I think that's what's going to happen to Britain. I have drawn the conclusion, just from talking to people in Brussels and from doing lectures on the continent, that it's not really possible to imagine that Brussels will allow England to leave in anything other than a pretend terms. I think Brussels is at best prepared to accept a kind of a pretend Brexit, where we've changed a few names, we changed the the paper that we write letters on, which change a few titles. But in all respects, there's a kind of neo-colonial impulse. It really reminds me of the way that neo-colonial powers used to negotiate with African and Asians, where basically said, you can have independence as long as we have our troops there, as long as the trade agreement gives us the priority over everybody else, as long as you pay us back for all of our investment into the indefinite future. I think that kind of neo-colonial ambition, which is very rarely expressed publicly, is really at work at the moment. And one of the reasons why many German politicians, many European politicians speak in such undiplomatic language when it comes to the negotiation. And it is shocking that politicians, serious politicians, would use such undiplomatic language to lecture Britain about democracy. I mean, weird idea. I think under those circumstances, we have to recognize that we're in for a very difficult future. And unless we recognize the problems that are ahead, we're going to have a lot of difficulties. And the book, I think, attempts to explain what the EU is all about, the real problems with the EU, not just simply make superficial criticisms about its bureaucracy, but its real value content. I think that's really important for us to think about in the period ahead. And I think we have to realize that in the year ahead, in the years ahead, we need to be able to not just simply get involved in the business of negotiation, simply get involved in trying to get the best possible terms, because if we do that, we'll lose sight of the real objectives that were behind Brexit in the first place. We have to recognize that the key thing that we should all be thinking about is not getting an extra concession from the EU, but what kind of world do we want to live in? What do we want British society to look like? And I think that's going to be our starting point. What should Britain look like, rather than what the EU will allow us to be? Thank you.
It's a real pleasure. Usually, for the last year, I've spent sitting on panels, and I would listen to the first speaker, and I would quietly start seething and thinking, so which bits I'm going to start with just saying you're wrong. So it was a great pleasure to actually be able to listen to a fellow panelist to say, I agree with everything you say. And just add, I think, a few more observations on that. And in a sense, I did completely change my mind on this, and I can still argue, wearing my German hat, as to why the Germans find this, for example, so unbelievable that the Brits could have decided to have left. And I can argue a British side. And I keep explaining that by the fact that I'm Bavarian by birth. Now, you have to remember that the Bavarians in the Napoleonic Wars fought with Napoleon against the Prussians. It's a federal state, and Bavarian exceptionalism is infamous in some areas. But what I've learned there, and I think adds onto something which Frank said about the Kantian nation state. To me, what the United Kingdom has always been so different was that I don't think the United Kingdom has ever given those who govern them any rights other than those they have conferred on them. They do not regard that the nation state has inherent powers as a nation state, which they can exercise over its citizens. And that what rules everything is the rule of law, and hence the kind of institutional and constitutional that successive governments don't bind their previous ones. So you can respond to situations. Now, if in this context of the referendum, we would have had a debate as to whether parliamentary democracy was still sufficient, whether it required something else, I think that would have been a very interesting debate to have had. But we didn't. And I don't want to rerun the referendum, but I just want to make 3 observations as a result of the referendum, which I think we have to deal with. One has been a real kind of abuse of language. It's when I had a note from a very serious national or international journalist after the Turkish coup, when he sent me an email saying, look what you've done now. And I sort of emailed back saying, I know I'm really powerful, but I'm probably not. I said, why, shall we just have a cup of coffee to talk about this? And he emailed back saying, I don't need to have a cup of coffee with you. You and I, we both know that you kind of politics leads to gas chambers. And I just went back and said, there's no basis for the conversation. And therefore what it means that if you coarsen the debate by making comparisons which are so outrageous, I actually think you do diminish the outrageous. If you call someone a Nazi these days, then it should only apply to people who intend to eradicate an entire race, gas 6.5 million, kill whole families, and try to go for global domination. If you don't do that, kindly come up with a different word. There's a kind of laziness, and it's the same where the term populist is used for someone who thinks that if you work in a democratic system, where by design the majority wins. And then the majority wins. It's the first time after this referendum, the winners had to explain themselves for having had the audacity to having won. I do think that means that internally we have to, as a parliamentary democracy, have some serious discussions as to how we use referenda. And if I compare the Welsh referendum, which had a turnout of just over 50%, and it was won by a margin of 0.7%, and nobody questioned it. With this one, where you had over 72%, you had a massive turnout. You had what by any democratic standards is a clear majority. And yes, you still get AC Grayling going on the television studios, giving me a highly sophisticated mathematical model is that, I'm delusional for thinking that more people voted to leave. So I think that's a real challenge. And we can deal with that internally. And I think we have to. We have to look at that, how our democratic institutions respond to that. The second big challenge is we do need to start to look at the post-World War II institutions. I mean, my problem with the European Union is that, quite frankly, the original 6, with 1 or 2 more, Austria, Denmark, you could probably had this one. You could have given that a single currency. You could have moved towards a governance structure, and you probably would have ended up with a structure that was coherent and worked. But then you had an institution that never had a neighborhood policy and could never deal with anything other than a relationship which meant you offer application for full membership. Therefore, it never dealt with it. And just as I was coming here, I sort of went a bit further past this building, a bit further down the road. There's a gallery open at the moment which has got Brexonia, this new nation, and it had 4 postcards on there. And it's the world according to ISIS, which was sort of, Mediterranean countries and a bit of the East, and then America, and then it had the UK view, which was sort of the whole world, and the British Isles, excluding ERA and excluding the European Union. And then it had the EU view of the world, which was the whole globe, and the only thing that was missing was England, the British Isles. And I thought that shows you the mindset that everything that is good, embracing, and global is EU, and anything that is not must by definition be excluding. And I thought, well, tell that to the friend of mine who's just come back from Switzerland. She was hiring a car, she's a British citizen, she was hiring a car and just said to the guy in Bâle, I'm about to take the car into Italy for a day, I don't suppose there's a problem. He said, oh yes, there is a problem. It will be confiscated at the border. Because there's a directive, and I checked this out, I'm not making this up, which says EU citizens are not allowed to drive cars with Swiss number plates in EU countries. So the hire company actually has cars on the border where you switch them over to the Italian registration. Now, I'm not telling that as a story of, madness of the EU, even though it is, but just as a kind of challenge of there's a mindset out there that everything that is liberal, that is outward-looking, that is permissive, that is forward-looking is the European Union, and if you find something wrong with that structure, then by definition you are either stupid, inward-looking, racist, or just some a creature of the past. And I find that intellectually that the liberal elites have become so illiberal in the process that what we turned against was a democratic structure. That was the thing of the accountability. So But then takes us to a really, really big challenge, and it's in the book. And to me, it was the most significant insight, which it was only once you said it that I realized that's what's at the heart of it. At the founding notion of the European Union, it was that you stopped Germany and France going to war with each other. They had done this fairly unsuccessfully, and with ever increasing damage for a period of 200 years. And you assumed there was a failure of the nation state, and at the heart they thought the real failure was ideology. So, I sort of make the note, what do you call it, Frank? You call it the technocratic governance, which tries to govern without ideology, but simply it's the promise of a better economic prosperity. Tomorrow will be better than it was today. And you see that, you always saw that in the Remain campaign, that they didn't try to defend the European Union as an institution. They just kept saying, well, of course, there's lots wrong with it, but by the way, if you don't vote for this, you will lose jobs and you'll be worse off. And this is a phenomenon which we have to be really careful about, because, I'm a Labour politician, so I look back, and Herbert Morrison famously said, socialist is what the Labour government does. Which New Labour then turned into we do what works. The Tories, in a sense, have started to copy that. And I think we as the politicians have to come back to being slightly more explicit about some core values. Because, and I sort of want to finish on that observation. Because, you see, to me, the real challenge we face at the moment is that there's on the one hand mob rule, which none of us think is a good thing, and it therefore needs to be contained and managed and moderated. And on the other hand, you have the empty bureaucratic efficiency, where as long as the trains run on time and everything works, never mind how you do it. But in between there, you've got groups of people who believe in something, and those groups kind of gather together, and then they form political parties, and then they meet in places like Parliament, and their relative strength is decided by the process of elections. And that's how I think you strike that balance between processes, which is neither mob rule nor that tyranny. But it does require something to believe in. And I think the challenge post-referendum for British politicians, quite apart from what the European continent has to do, is I think we need to look at parliamentary democracy and popular democracy, and probably become a bit more outspoken in some of the things which believe in, whether they're popular or not popular, but we are prepared to defend them because we think they're right or wrong.
Frank, I don't know if you want to come back on any of Gisela's points about the, particularly interested in this idea that values, which are obviously implicit in so much of what the EU does, even though it pretends it doesn't have the same values as an old empire. It obviously is driven by some kind of worldview, and that's often positioned in opposition to a very old style of national identity, old style of national values, which Hungary does embody.
I mean, in the book, what I try to do is to deal with, in fact, the book ends on what I call the crisis of valuation, which has been around for a very long time. And I think that the problem that we face is that politicians for a very long time have self-consciously evaded that question. And very often you will find that when you look at the way that politicians talk and the way they speak, they very rarely talk the language of good and evil, of right and wrong. And I often get very frustrated when I hear a politician sort of trying to justify a particular policy. They don't say this is good, these are the values that I believe in. They will say that research shows. Or they will say that according to the evidence, this is what we must do. And there's always a continuous attempt to turn the language of politics into a neutral, technical, non-value related sort of dynamic, which then means that as young people enter into public life, it's very difficult for them to be idealistic. I think one of the tragedy of political life is that the scope for idealism or believing in something that is valuable is very difficult. I think that most people have very strong negative values where they know that this is evil and this is wrong, but they find it very difficult to say what is good, what is the good life. And one of the reasons why, in the course of writing this book, I ended up defending Hungary is because, for all their sins, Hungarians are desperately trying to have a political life that's value-based. Now, I might not agree with all their values, but some of them are quite nice, a little bit old-fashioned, but maybe I'm getting old, but sometimes some old-fashioned values like honesty, integrity, courage, sort of all those basic Greek virtues are not necessarily problems for us. They're things that we can well do within the 21st century. And I think that unless we do confront this question of values, we'll end up in a world that we live in today, where people, in the course of struggling for values all the time, end up into what we see happening is this completely promiscuous, completely uncontrolled dynamic towards identity politics, where instead of being able to say, this is good, the value that I uphold is myself. It's all about me. I become the focus of all the debate and all the discussion. And so I do think that the issue of values is very important, which is why I think that the most important challenge that faces us is to be able to give meaning to popular sovereignty in the 21st century. Because popular sovereignty is the only foundation on which a democratic society can survive. It's the only foundation that on which basis you can legitimate any kind of authority. And if you avoid the issue of popular sovereignty, then the basic principles of the Enlightenment and the basic values that are associated will become entirely sidelined.
There's one section in your book which is absolutely fascinating about the point in which the EU realizes that economic prosperity is not sufficient or a sufficient way to bind the people of Europe together. And the EU authorities turn to history, and particularly the Holocaust, the one defining event which gives them a moral framework, and how that works up to a point, and then Eastern Europe joins the EU, and they have a different take. Maybe you could just say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I should have mentioned this. That it's something that I was very surprised by, because when you look at the history of the EU and look at some of the archival evidence, at a certain point they realized that the foundation on which European unity was based, which was economic success, constant levels of productivity increases, sort of was insufficient to really inspire people and bind them together. So what does the EU do? Well, they do exactly what the British governments always do. They hire some public relation company. And you have a successive number of public relations company that are meant to come up with the idea of Europe. And if you read their idea of Europe, it is a joke. I mean, it's like as if children wrote it, sort of it. Basically, the idea of Europe is you have, sort of some black children, some Asian children, some Roma people, some Scandinavians all holding together and kissing each other. This is Europe at its best. This is the high point of European civilization. And the problem that they have is that they cannot go back to real European values because it's very, very divisive. So after a while, they decide that well, what is it that can bind us together? What is it that we all feel strongly about? And they realized that actually the Holocaust, which they ignored, the European Union founding fathers ignored the Holocaust all the way through the 50s and the 60s. It wasn't really a big issue. But all of a sudden, in the late 70s and early 80s, the Holocaust becomes sacralized. It becomes almost like what original sin is to Christian people, a kind of a defining moment. And you have what I see as being the exploitation of the Holocaust in a way that is actually highly problematic, where you trivialize what the Holocaust was really all about by using it as a way of referring to everything as being a Holocaust. And basically by almost making feel people guilty for things that they bear no responsibility for in the 20th or 21st century. And I think that misuse of the Holocaust is going to cost everybody dearly. But then what happens, East Europeans join, and East Europeans having lived under Stalinism for decades and decades and decades, say, well, actually, our problem, the one that haunts us and the one that we feel very strongly about, is not the paradigm of the Holocaust, but it's the paradigm of Stalinism. And we want both of those to be seen as being of equal importance. And that's really when the present-day debates between East Europe and Western Europe really begin to kick in as to what kind of history we should have. And in many respects, what's interesting about the EU today is that the debates are all about the past. It's all about how we memorialize the past, rather than about looking forward to some kind of future and future alternatives.
I mean, Gisela, obviously, the book refers to Germany and Merkel, how Merkel has positioned. Now, I don't want to just ask you about Germany, obviously, but there's a fascinating kind of almost dichotomous presentation of the values that Merkel presents, which are trying to deal with a German history and a German kind of perception of Germany around the world. And then Hungary as almost the diametrical opposite in terms of promoting its national identity.
It's, I just want to sort of make one big observation which you have to remember. The notion of Germanness and the boundaries of a nation state called Germany had not been concurrent until unification in 1989. So even the notion of Germanness is a troubled one, were the Austrians Germans or weren't there? Even in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there never was a problem for the Hungarians, even though, saying earlier on, Queen Gisela of Hungary was a saint. But I think Germany is very interesting in the sense that, and forgive me if I hope I'm not seen rude when we talk about one author's book, I also mention one other, which if you want to look, if you want a book about just Germany, the guy called Paul Lever, who was our ambassador to Berlin, has brought out a book called Berlin Rules, where he looks at that real problem Germany has. It is trying to hide. It tries not to be that central that power in the center of Europe, but it is. You can't escape that, and I take a very troubled view of Merkel as an individual. When Neil McGregor had that big exhibition in the British Museum on Germany, the history of a nation, and I always thought it was extraordinary that he took a Brit to explain to the Germans what it means to be German, and he did that very successfully. She went round and there were two moments where she was virtually in tears. And the first one was when she saw a Gutenberg Bible where Martin Luther had written in the margins, "The Lord's my shepherd." And of course, this is someone born in the West whose father went to the East. And there she grew up in that sort of fairly sort of Protestant. But the second one was that there was a model there of the Berlin railway station where if you lived in the East, you and your elderly parents could come and visit. But the Stasi had its spies positioned, and she saw that model of the railway station where the Stasi were training their spies as to where they had to position themselves. And she said, my grandmother would come every August, and I always knew that in the last week of August, we'd all be standing in that railway station crying because Granny was leaving again for a year. And, I mean, to me, she is a figure, kind of epitomizes that struggle of the Germans. And the big thing for me in my lifetime has that Germany has become pacifist. And actually, it now has to do that next step and actually realize it is a significant power, and it cannot. And who was that Polish foreign minister who said, "I used to be worried about German action, and now I'm worried about German inaction." So, and I think it's interesting when you see that from the different views.
I think what Germany did after the war, in order to, in a sense, evade its past and try to neutralize the kind of the struggle that it had with its identity, was to become the good Europeans. I mean, that was basically a self-conscious project within Germany, which had its good bits about it. In a sense, what they were trying to do was to somehow find a way in which the tensions, the historical conflicts between Germany and other societies could be somehow reconciled. And I think that the problem is that Germany, like any other nation, in the end cannot simply be good Europeans without, in a sense, accounting for your own history. And I think it's very, very sad that when I talk to German historians or when I go to museums to do with Europe, it's almost as if the Germans, like a lot of other people in Europe, have this obsession with having a year zero idea of history. And the year zero idea of history is everything before 1945 was horrible. Everything since 1945 is brilliant. And that's dishonest, both about the past and the present, because there were great moments in European history that we need to celebrate. We don't have to be embarrassed about. Probably more great moments than bad moments, in my opinion. And there's a lot of problems that have occurred since 1945 that we shouldn't really be celebrating. And I think that's an area that Germans in particular need to explore, because the longer it's evaded, the more it stores up problems for the future.
Can I ask you about the issue of immigration, which has pushed the EU or forced the EU to confront a number of these contradictions that you've pointed out? The fact that actually it is Fortress Europe. There is a barrier around Europe. It's not a government for the world. And of course, Germany, Merkel made a decision about immigration which has tested both her own electorate but also other countries. Hungary and Orban has very stridently said, we are not going to be told to accept migrants by Germany. We're going to, have our own position on immigration. And obviously it played a role in the EU referendum in this country. In the defence of national sovereignty, that implies also a defence of borders and democratic control of borders. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about your own position or thinking about that. And you talk about it a bit in the book, but if you want to expand a little.
Well, I think we all need borders, and I think we all need to have the authority to control our own society and control the movement of people into our society. Myself, I'm a believer in the free movement of people. And therefore, I have got no problems with people moving around from one state to another, but I also believe that if there's going to be a free movement of people, that's going to have to be arrived at through democratic decision-making. In other words, the majority of the people in a society will have to agree to the free movement of people. I also think there's another problem, which is that every European nation is different. And I can understand why Hungary doesn't want migrants in its society. I mean, Hungary has been dominated by one nation after another throughout its history. It's been dominated by the Ottoman Empire, it's been dominated by the Mongolian Empire, it's been dominated by the Austrians, it's been dominated by the Germans and the Russians. And I think that if you're Hungarian, then I think you're entitled to feel that you would like to have real control over your own society, and that you do regard the pressures that are brought to bear down upon you as the latest version of domination that you've experienced throughout your history. And that's got to be taken on board. I think some societies, Latvia or Lithuania, would have a different attitude towards migration than France or Germany or Britain, which are much larger societies. And some societies, such as Britain, have played an imperial global role. They've created relationships with their ex-colonies. And I do think that under those circumstances, you do have to have a much more open, tolerant, liberal orientation towards the movement of people. So I think it's a complex issue, but on balance, the key thing is let's have authority over deciding who comes in, and then people like myself will argue for the most liberal, the most tolerant orientation towards immigration. I think that's a balance that I'm comfortable with.
And I think that the real challenge which we're facing is that I don't think any of our post-World War II institutions have really adapted to the global flows of goods, people, and money. And if you go back to the flows of private capital, which we last saw in the 19th century, after World War II, all kinds of arrangements thought we could deal with that. And the 2008 banking crisis was that kind of crash because the private sector was creating money in a way which the international institutions couldn't handle anymore. I think with goods we're slightly better in the sense that WTO rules developed, and the one where we've completely failed is these massive global flows of people. You know, the EU's sort of initial response thought that the solution would be to subcontract it to Turkey. You know, and you just pushed the borders further out and sort of said, here's a dosh of money. But what it doesn't deal with, and I think this is the bit which, there's three principles which I think we have to recognize. First one is, there is not a single country that does not demand the right to determine who can live within its boundaries and who can't. And in a sense where, you know, that sense of place and belonging, and whether you raise your taxes and where you do your voting and all that, you know, that is part of your democratic structures. The second one is that I find it really difficult to understand how you can regard it as being social and liberal, that you overcome your inability to train, for example, enough doctors and nurses in your own country by taking them from some of the poorest countries on the globe, or by saying, you know, isn't it fantastic that we've got 800,000 of Poland's youngest and brightest working over here? Well, is that really so good for Poland when you think about it? You know, there are movements which I think are good and are incredibly beneficial, and they're managed. And again, I get very angry when there's this notion of, particularly when I get a student who sort of says, oh, well, now that we're leaving, you know, Erasmus is coming to an end. And I feel like saying, you know, Erasmus existed before the European Union. You know, the intellectual elites have always traveled. There have been movements of people. But I do think we have to have a realization that economic and global pressures do deal with movements of people. And we cannot just pick and choose as to who we think should deal with that. And the European Union has singularly failed. But I just want to say something about Germany and the refugees. What you have to appreciate is, post 1945, a destroyed Germany of a population of 45 million absorbed 15 million of ethnic German refugees. You will not find a single German family that will not have either a first-hand or within the sort of once removed family experience, knows what it's like to have to pack your suitcase. Now, I know it's not a much told story, because the whole swathe of the world who actually think, and I had it said to me, well, the Germans were rather asking for it, you know, and, you know, it's a completely different debate, but you have to realize that I think they had it was the gamble Merkel took, that she thought in an aging population it was the right thing to do, but also from her point of view it was a kind of moral right thing to do. Where I think she was completely wrong was not preparing her own population for that and getting a consent to it, but then also demanding from everybody else to sort of say, and because I made that decision, I expect the same decision from you. That's not really how you go about things.
I think that there's 2 points that haven't been mentioned yet, which is immigration, when it's used as a policy, is often used as a way of undermining national traditions. And I think very often politicians in Germany and in Britain and elsewhere often rely upon immigrants in a way that I find very troubling, as a kind of political counterweight against what they see as the old Germans and the old English. So I think that there's that aspect to it, where there's a kind of social engineering element to that. And secondly, and this is, I think, the most important point of all, which is that the real problem for me is not immigration as such. The real problem is multiculturalism. Because what's wrong with multiculturalism is not that, you know, we shouldn't be appreciating each other's culture and being close to each other. I think what multiculturalism does is to suggest that assimilating into the dominant culture of a society is somehow wrong. And if you talk to people in certain political circles, the word assimilation is sneered at. Now, I remember as a refugee being in Canada, and I just remember all of us wanted to be Canadians as fast as possible. we didn't go to Canada to recreate Budapest in Montreal. Right? That wasn't, and similarly, assimilation was seen as a way of using the talents and energies of different kinds of people to build a nation together. And assimilationism also recognizes that the people that come from that society, who are born there, have a logical priority in terms of rights over anybody else. And if you erase that distinction, if you somehow say everybody, come in and we're all in it together, then you destroy the foundation of democracy itself. Because it means that being a citizen of a nation has got no privileged status in terms of your commitment and your role in public life compared to anybody else. And I think that seems to me to be a really important struggle to engage in, that somehow we have to rehabilitate the idea of assimilation and not assume that if you want to call for it, you're somehow nationalistic or racist or xenophobic. You're basically doing the right thing. And that's a value that I think we should all sort of go out and argue about.
I thought that line that Theresa May gave in that speech when she said, if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere, was fascinating, the reaction. Whatever you might think of that line, and I think it's worth deconstructing it and arguing the pros and cons. It was fascinating that people's reaction was, there is no such thing really as citizenship, and national citizenship is so out of date, and I don't think of myself as a national citizen. It was fascinating that people felt culturally that they had to take a side in that. Okay, let's go out to the audience.
Kerry Dingle from the charity World Right and Citizen TV, World Bites. 2 quick questions. Gisela, could you just tell us a bit more what you mean when you, I believe, sarcastically refer to mob rule, which you did in your introduction? And for Frank, and probably for both of you, could you say where or what you think, or is it a dead end, internationalism might now mean? I understand your point, Frank, about the criminalisation of ideas of national sovereignty and popular sovereignty and the ridiculous, fluffy cosmopolitanism. But what about the internationalism of 100 years ago, for example, of which we've had few examples, really, historically, but nonetheless was quite an inspiring universalist outlook and project?
I'd be interested to know if you think there's a connection between the modern mainstream left's enthusiasm for transnational government and the way in which the modern left is now characterized by a sort of post-ideological, non-relational type of thinking. The old left seemed to understand that social solidarity could only exist within a particular material and cultural context, whereas the modern left now seem to employ sort of free-floating concepts, vaguely defined values, which are totally unrelated to reality, and that applies, I think, both to the Blairites, but also to the sort of Corbynistas.
My question was, you talked about Hungary. Poland equally seems to be increasingly on a collision course with the European Commission. I wanted to know your thoughts on where you think that's going, and also, more generally, who you think will back down first between the European Union and the Central and Eastern European countries on the issue of accepting refugees?
It's a very interesting question. East Europe is a little bit different, so when I give lectures or talks in Hungary, people always applaud me for my position on Brexit. And they say, it's really good that you're for Brexit, but we Hungarians couldn't possibly leave the European Union because we are so dependent on it. And I've been to Poland, and I heard very similar stuff being said there, that we don't like the EU, and we resent being lectured at. But at the end of the day, economic reality is. And I think there's a kind of a problem there. And I think that as a result of that, the outcome of this conflict is unclear. I think in the short term, there will be accommodation on both sides. But I think the long-term dynamic is for far greater fragmentation to occur. I think East Europe, Greece, Portugal, many of these other places are going to find it very difficult to maintain their pro-EU position for into the indefinite future. I just want to say one thing about transnationalism, which has become one of my favorite hate words. Because transnationalism sounds beautiful. It's the kind of, over breakfast, oh my God, transnational, we're transcending the nation into nirvana. But actually what transnationalism means is institutionalizing not being accountable. Because the beauty of transnational civic society, as they call it, is that we're talking on your behalf. I mean, all these NGOs, if you go to a global conference, there are more NGOs there than rats. I mean, just everywhere, and they're all talking on our behalf. They all all say beautiful things, but nobody ever elected them. They've never been, sort of held to account. And I think that transnational ideal is a very undemocratic and potentially oppressive institution into which the technocratic elites can, in a sense, retreat. And the more we value transnationalism, the more real democracy gets diminished in terms of its kind of content. I think there's a slight confusion of two things, internationalism and universalism. The universalism is an ideal that many of us, like myself, uphold 120%. Universal values are very much integral to into the Enlightenment. And we can even have internationalist aspirations. I think that recognizing the common quality of our humanity and human and international solidarity are positive virtues. But it seems to me that anything more than that in terms of institutions and institutional building would end up with a kind of world government, would end up with a kind of abstract set of institutions that would inevitably be out of touch with the real world and will inevitably be at the expense of the exercise of popular sovereignty. So we can have internationalism as an ideal that we kind of live with, but it's not a contradiction to the primacy, to the logical priority of national sovereignty.
Gisela.
I want to sort of directly address this question on the mob rule. And it goes to the nature of political leadership. I think politicians do have a duty to sometimes take the population at large in a direction which naturally the people wouldn't go. I mean, otherwise we might have just have constant phone-ins. Slavery would not have abolished if you'd asked the people whether the majority wanted that. We still would have the death penalty if we always went with the majority. A lot of human rights, gay rights, these kind of things you have to come out first. You make your case. You bring about some change because you think is right, and you sometimes have to take the people with you. When I talk about mob rule is when politicians simply respond to whichever group of people are shouting loudest at any given time. That's why I sort of said that I really didn't want to go down that road, and I think you have to contain that. Or you have to give it a framework within which it operates and has some values to it. But I just want to really come back to this, the left and the new left and the old left. And wearing my Change Britain hat, we did some 4,000 interviews, 2,000 before the general election, 2,000 after. And we were looking at some trends and something which was emerging, which I thought was to me absolutely fascinating, and various other bits are supporting that. And it's a change of view of the under 35s. It's the generation where 50% went to university, and they no longer regard, for example, university education as a privilege. They're kind of regarded as I should be grateful they've given 3 years of their life before they go on their gap year, and this notion that they should be paying for that is even more extraordinary. They don't believe in the contributory principle. They actually do believe in a kind of entitlement. The notion for the Labour Party that blue Labour, which was in traditional working class areas, white working class areas like we would have had in South Birmingham in the old car industry, that is not where the Labour Party is moving. The Labour Party, by and large, is becoming like the American Democrats, which is a very urban, rights-based movement. And I think the Labour Party makes a big, big mistake if it actually abandons those kind of roots in the working class communities. That's where I see that different of where, you know, the old and the new Labour is moving. It's the left is becoming a very entitlement-based urban phenomena.
Just on Gisela's last point about the people who shout the loudest, I thought that was quite interesting, because the people who've been shouting the loudest over the last year have been kind of pro-elite, pro-Remain, and what excited me about the Brexit vote is I was hoping ordinary people were going to get more of a voice, and that's, you know, I like the way you came back on things. You know, it didn't sound like you were saying it was ordinary people that were the problem. You know, I take your point about that. But what struck me over the past year is that people have, even though, you know, we voted for Brexit, that there hasn't been as much change as maybe I would have liked. There's been a lot more kind of stability and, you know, kind of what Theresa May kind of going on about, steady as she goes, you know. So what do you think are the prospects for, you know, some popularisation and the reinvigoration of politics in Britain and Europe today?
At the beginning you talked about the problem of abuse of language, and through this whole event I found that very difficult, because I voted Leave because I believe in democracy, and yet that word seems to have been very much hijacked by the other side, if you like, you know, in the sense of believing that democracy is about people, their points of view about how they want to live their life and what meaning they want to bring to their life is equally valid and should be equally brought into a public scenario. And then obviously you have a situation when there's people argue on both sides, and then there's a vote, and then whoever wins the vote, in some way society moves forward in respect to that. And yet, you know, it seems like we can't use that term democracy now. Today in The Guardian, I don't know if people saw, but there's an article about who would you put a statue up of, and someone said, I'd put it up of Gina Miller, because she's been the greatest Democrat through this whole process because of her belief in parliamentary democracy, and that parliamentary is about representation, not delegation, and she's the person who's stood up for that. So how do we reclaim, say, something like democracy, which to me seems a fundamental value to fight for?
Hi, David Axe from Invoke Democracy Now. Have we got an opportunity? I'd be interested in your views on this, both you, Frank, and Gisela. Are we being presented with an opportunity now to have a discussion about kind of national democratic renewal? I mean, one of the main themes from your book, Frank, is about the outsourcing of authority and the outsourcing of political authority. So, you know, it's clear that, you know, the UK government outsourcing political authority to the EU. You know, we don't have control of that. That's something that comes under the auspices of the EU, and unfortunately, that means that you, as the UK electorate, don't have any control over that. That's dealt with somewhere else, effectively. And so you can see how politics is kind of hollowed out by that process. But there's also an element where we've got used to political decision-making being outsourced in other directions. You know, economic decision-making being outsourced to the Bank of England as an independent organisation, as an example. So this seems to be this. You know, the vote to leave the EU seems to create an opportunity to have a discussion about national democratic renewal. You know, would you agree with that? And then also, kind of supplementary question: should we now be thinking about creating a genuine internationalism based upon the recognition of, you know, the sovereign rights of other nations and the democratic rights of their citizenry to control the affairs of those nations?
A lot of the questions are about the future and the potential for renewing politics. I think that there are two issues here. If we can give real content to popular sovereignty and actually explain the ideal in a serious manner, that it is really about democracy, that everybody has got the right, every citizen has got a right to have their say on the key issues of our day. And then we invite people to go beyond just the odd elections, but to find ways that they can express their views on a whole lot of matters. Then I think that popular sovereignty could really begin to work. I slightly disagree with Gisela's point on mob rule, in the sense that I would rather have a debate on capital punishment and maybe even risk losing the vote, but convincing as many people as possible that capital punishment is wrong, than to just impose sort of a law against capital punishment from above without winning hearts and minds. And I think that whenever possible, the winning of hearts and minds has got to be what drives us, even though we often risk losing the argument. And I think the reason why I feel strongly about that is because there's so many issues over which we are too scared to have the argument. And so we do evade it, so many times. I think the future of our politics in this country, any kind of renewal, depends, and I know I'm going to be very unpopular when I say this, is to actually decide now, not tomorrow, not the day after, that we're going for Brexit. There's no soft Brexit, there's no hard Brexit, there's a Brexit. And I think that we need to get across the idea that regardless of what happens in the negotiation, this is where we're going. And if Brussels doesn't like it, that's a problem, and we're not very happy with that, but we're still going ahead with that. Yeah. That at the end of the day, regardless of what sort of is going on there, there's an objective, there's a goal that we want people to commit to. And I think if we can create a kind of crusade around this objective and politicize the public in terms of understanding that it's a positive option, not a negative option, then I think that could be the basis, the raw material on which politics can renew itself, because it just draws in more and more people into the public domain.
I think it's worth coming back to this mob rule thing, because I think it's really important. I think the point I was trying to make is that we have in many ways lost, as politicians, that ability to genuinely engage in policy debates. You still have to give leadership, and then you have to have hearts and minds follow you sometimes. You don't just impose this. And the classic example I had for about 2 years ago, when we had this free vote on assisted dying, where I had, for all sorts of reasons, actually very strong personal views. And I arranged 3 public meetings in the constituency, one organized by the churches, one organized by the doctors, and the other one was a civic one. I literally, on this one, just said, I took a lawyer with me and said, 10 minutes, you explain the bill to them, just what's in the thing. And I said, and I just sit here, and I'm going to listen to you, because I want to keep checking whether I'm still right. And it was absolutely extraordinary, the results. Even, the churches were actually the most divided ones on the subject, which was the least one I expected. But we haven't gone out to sort of say, this is what we believe in, and then go and win the hearts and minds. I still think you need to persuade. But I just want to just do the Brexit stuff. I'm very lucky that I have got naturally very low blood pressure. But there are 3 things which, to this day, absolutely get me going. The one is the sneering on the Today programme and Channel 4 News. And it isn't even just what they say, it's the kind of, despite Brexit, the world has not come to an end, and it will still rain tomorrow. It is just, and it really does frustrate me. And equally, of a lot of politicians still sort of go and say, well, of course we respect the result, and now we're going to do everything to make sure it doesn't happen. And to this day, and this is where I really take issue with the government, is so Monday evening I was at the dinner for the Board of Jewish Deputies, and Ruth Davidson was the guest who was being interviewed. And the whole debate was a kind of saying, well, of course I voted to remain and I campaigned to remain, but I do respect the fact that the people voted to leave. But of course, if there was another referendum tomorrow, I would vote remain again. And I sit there and saying, To have voted to leave is not an illness that requires explanation and treatment. It's a democratic decision which you now, as you are the government, could you just kindly get on with and implement it? So you still got even, and this is where the referendum problem comes in, is the ownership of the outcome. You know, with the general election, you wouldn't dream of a prime minister sort of saying, well, I didn't really agree with the party manifesto, but because my side has won, so, you know, I'm just going to implement it. And it's a real difficulty, and I think she should have started the negotiations straight away. And essentially, my opening sentences to Michel Barnier, who I spent 15 months in Brussels with negotiating, I would have said, Michel, you're about to lose your second largest contributor. We are leaving. We've got to make sure we can leave. You have a problem because you're losing us. Don't you think it's in both of our interests to just sit down and get a deal, which means that both of us get something which is workable? So, you know, your frustration, all I can say is I just share it, and it's not very good for my blood pressure.
If you agree that Gisela Stuart should be in charge of our negotiations in Brussels, please write to your MP.
Okay, thank you both. That was really, really interesting. I mean, this wasn't my point, but just to answer Gisela, well, what happened to all the leaders of Brexit? What happened to the Leave campaign? I mean, you know, people who, you were wonderful, but what happened? Why did everyone, the minute the vote was cast, exit the stage as quickly as they could? So sorry, I had to say that. So I just wanted to read, this was a bit more of a question about the reimagining sovereignty and kind of what do we need for that. And one of the things that we need, obviously, is a demos as some kind of coherent group of people who share the same ideas. And so on. And I think, in a slightly abstract way, that's one of the things that's quite problematic. Like, it was so striking, you know, end of the Cold War, Maastricht. What do all the East European states who've just come out of Stalinism or some kind of, you know, very difficult socialism in terms of former Yugoslavia, what did they want to do? They want to join the European Union. And that's because within those states, and so I think Hungary and Poland are being a little bit disingenuous. I think it's more than just economic. I think the problem was that you were kind of, there was no forward-looking project, and the EU kind of represented that next step. And I think that's so, actually, for a lot of EU countries, in a way, you can't get off the bicycle. You know, you have to keep pedaling because there's nothing there. And I think that's one of the things. It's almost like we're at the end of the idea of the nation state. And, you know, I think also, just thinking about it in the context of Britain, I think that is really one of the big questions. Like, is there a kind of nation there? Because, yeah, we could easily say, oh, well, yes, of course, I voted Leave. Of course, the Leave vote shows that people do want to take back control. But there's not kind of much content there, you know. And on the ground, this idea of taking back control exists perfectly well with general social attitudes, for example, that you should, you know, not allow people to eat the foods they want. Do you know what I mean? So it's not like there is actually, it's a more complicated thing. It's not like there is necessarily a big movement for people to re-establish sovereignty truly over themselves and their own society and make their own decisions as real people. So I think the whole thing is a bit more, yeah, so that's really just your reflections on what can we reimagine sovereignty in the UK, say?
This is maybe going a step back in just looking at what the EU is about. And I just wanted to challenge Gisela because, and speaking as a half German myself, it's not bashing Germans, but I don't see the role of Germany as being benign. This business of, you know, they don't want to be a big nation. I think they're quite conscious of being the most, they can't be anything other than being conscious of being the most powerful nation in Europe and one of the most powerful in the world. And I think in the EU itself, the way they have treated Greece, and I know we can call it the EU, but at the end of the day, who is behind it? Wolfgang Schäuble, you know, it's the people, the powers behind it. They may have the fig leaf of a Luxembourg man or a Frenchman or a Spaniard, but it's Germany. And I really do see, and I'm somebody who has fought against the German bashing, having grown up here and being called a Nazi when I was at school. It's not something that comes easily to me because I've changed. The same as I used to be very pro-EC, I've changed to anti-EU, but I've come to see the German role as not being benign. It's in the interests of Germany, and it's basically subjugating nations in a way that Adolf Hitler could have only dreamed of. You know, it's done without the jackboot, it's done with economics.
Can I ask you, Frank touched on it when he was talking about the views of the Hungarians and the Poles towards the European Union. But can I ask you, the speakers, from your contacts in the continental European Union, is there any other people or any strand of opinion which agrees with what the sort of humane, grounded, sensible views which you expressed at the start about the way the European Union is going? Can I just as well, great thanks to Invoke Democracy for putting this on, but also can I express my profound gratitude to our speakers for the contribution they've made to public life in this country and are making. And I'm very grateful to be here.
Thank you. Our decision gave the government a job to do, and I think we have to make sure that they do it. One of the speakers earlier talked about how the leaders of the Leave campaign have disappeared. I think that's a little unfair, actually. But also, the local groups haven't disappeared. I live in Redbridge, and our local group has been meeting regularly, and we're calling a meeting of other people to get together to help to ensure that we make a success of Brexit. So I think there is a lot going on in London as well. Thank you.
I know, Gisela, in a lot of your talks you talk about the lack of a demos because of the number of countries at the EU. I think it would be good to focus on the fact that the Kratos, that the power of the executive of the EU is held partly in the Commission, I think mainly in the Commission, but also in the Council of Ministers. But then the Council of Ministers, it's this ephemeral power because, of course, leaders of each individual countries are removed, but yet the continuing view is the same. And you talk about the fact that something gets proposed and then is ignored for 10 years and then it's implemented. So if you could have, I know because of your experience, if you could speak about the problem with the Kratos and the fact that the demos can not only not remove the Kratos, it can never remove the Kratos, it seems to me, unless, of course, you vote to leave. And even then, it seems to be a bit difficult to get rid of them.
Yes, I just wanted to go back to the lady at the back who was talking about Greece. And you were talking about the East-West division within Europe, but isn't there also a North-South division? And particularly with the problems regarding the common currency and the enormous sort of impositions this has placed on particularly countries like Greece, but also Spain and Italy. And I mean, this is a sort of ticking time bomb within the EU, is whether they can deal with the economic problems caused by the common currency, of trying to, instead of wielding your currency, fitting your currency to your economy, they're trying to fit these disparate economies to a single currency. But it seems to me that the difference between the referendum in 75, which I was involved in, and the referendum we had last year, is that in 1975, it seemed to be that the 6 countries we wanted to join were much better than we were at all sorts of things, at organising their economies, at having full employment, at having better wages, at having better pensions, having better climate. Why can't we, if we joined them, we'd have all these things. But of course we didn't. But the difference last year was, of course, that the elites are no longer as competent as they were, and that in fact they can't deliver the economic nirvana that was promised, and people only had to look at Spain and Italy and Greece to see that.
Do you think the dynamic between the elite and the people is a good way of understanding what's happening in politics today? The essential difference being that the elite really dislike the people. In fact, it often borders on a hatred of the people because they really prefer technocrats, experts, and lawyers. And as Gisela said, they're very sort of rights-based, very, they love the notion of the rule of law, because that means you can just lay down the law and govern people by decree, effectively, rather than winning hearts and minds. So that's the sort of rights-based individualism of the elite. And then you have the people, who are much more community-focused, concerned about family, and of course very keen on democracy, because in a democracy they are equal, and they're more interested in having their hearts and minds swayed one way or the other, because they don't have all the preferential treatments that the elites have. It just seems to me that's quite a useful dynamic for understanding what's happening in society these days, and it's one of the problems, I think, for both the Tories and the Labour Party, is that they've got one foot in each camp and they don't quite know at the moment which way they're going to go. It's also very similar to David Goodhart's anywhere versus somewhere dynamic, and I personally find it very useful for understanding, but I just wonder what you both thought.
Frank mentioned in his opening statement something about the EU having neo-colonial ambitions and wanting to try and retain some control on Britain after Brexit process was completed. Could you expand on that a little, and perhaps whether Gisela could comment on whether she agrees with those remarks?
Yeah, I just wondered if both speakers feel like that you truly understand the Brexit vote. And I don't mean what it ought to mean in the future, but actually where it came from and why it happened, and why, is there something about the history of Britain and the kind of political culture of Britain that explains why Brexit happened here? I mean, obviously Brexit can't happen anywhere else. It wouldn't be called Brexit, but why is it that kind of it came here first in this very definitive way that had kind of global repercussions, as far as I can see?
Some of us in this room share your frustrations about the delay in the implementation of Brexit. With us at Invoke Democracy now, believe you me, we want to make it happen. We want to fulfil the democratic mandate of the Leave vote. So if you're interested in working with us, and believe you me, I'm interested in working with you, and maybe through working together we can actually make it happen.
We've talked a lot about kind of political strategy to reclaim democracy, and I just wondered, I think there's so much in Frank's book which is actually about the cultural war, and it was very striking during the referendum that 95% of the cultural sector in a survey that's often cited supported the EU, and whether actually part of this is about trying to reclaim some cultural idea of democracy and some cultural idea of national sovereignty. And when I was reading Frank's book, I was reminded of a quote of George Orwell's when he talks about the fact that, you know, whatever you might think of the working class and their sentimentality about national identity and being British, it is a comelier thing than the smug self-righteousness of the liberal elite. And I was struck by that phrase when the referendum campaign was happening. It's just so easy to be culturally snobbish about the identity that people still feel an attachment to at large. And maybe, you know, this is a culture war as much as it is a kind of a political battle as well. Anyway, enough from me. Gisela first, and then Frank. I'll give you the final.
The fundamental thing which I think is different between the British, and I use this very deliberately in the United Kingdom, is that when George I took the throne in 1714, that was the last time the British Isles were a continental power. He was the Elector of Hanover as well as the King of England. You then had the Act of Union, and you then had a development of a supranational identity. And it has not seen in its collective memory a failure of the nation state. It therefore does not fear the nation state and already has a supranational identity. And I think for virtually all the other mainland European countries, they have within a living memory the failure of the nation state. And they feel to protect them from the dark side, as I see it, of nationalism. The supranational identity is meant to make you a better person. Hence the structure of the commission, which actually was a government. They're kind of structures of these kind of irremovable wise men who will always protect the people from their extremism and what have you. And therefore they cannot be removed because that is your safeguard. And hence, I would say the reason why the referendum in 76 went the way it did. And by the way, I arrived during the 3-day week in 1974. I know what a basket case this country was, you know. Nylon bedsheets, salami was exotic, you know. 1-bar gas fires. But proper water pressure on shower heads was unheard of. And a lot of the sort of the Remain campaign sort of was arguing as if the United Kingdom would revert to where it was in 1976 if it voted to leave. You know, that overnight the television sets would turn black and white again. And that everything that happened good in civilizations in 1976 or 73 was all because of the European Union. I had this argument with Stanley Johnson, and I said, Stanley, do you really think the Brits wouldn't have reached the point that they would have cleaned up their beaches? Do you really think the only reason why British beaches are clean now is because the European Union... No, the world changed, and I think the European Union had built that in. But on a positive note, I just want, I mean, yeah, and also the relationship with nation states. When the United Kingdom joined the European Union, it deprived every other small state in Europe of the option of how it wished to relate to its neighbors. Up to that point, you had the common market, which was an economic project, which always had a political endgame. Or you had EFTA, which was a trading relationship. The minute Brits abandoned EFTA and joined the EEC, the balance changed. And that was really important, you know, I think very significant. And of course, when all the former communist states came in, I remember traveling to all of them ahead of the Prague summit in 2004, where it actually was decided not so much whether EU membership would go ahead, but actually whether, apart from Poland, which was already a NATO state, whether NATO would accept them. And in those days, if you were in the Baltic states, to them, NATO membership was a darn sight more important than EU membership. So I think we tend to forget about the historic dynamics, which takes us to the future. So 23rd of June last year, I said to Boris, I said, on the 24th, I'm going home and mowing the lawn. It's yours, you know. We've done the bit. And this is the nature of the referendum, that the cross-party organization which produces it, sort of, we handed the responsibility back to government. But we continued to run Vote Leave, which is very much a kind of the database. And I never answered your question about national renewal. You're absolutely right. I'm doing a lot of work with Maurice Glassman and also Robert Salisbury on going around and looking at regions, like we've just done some in the West Midlands, and say there's this amazing window of about 18 months where our local government structures we have to look at again, because the regional mayors, all that thing, plus powers coming back. This is your chance of how do you want to rewrite a lot of the rules, a lot of the things you hadn't thought about. And I think the real energy, other than controlling the blood pressure, and I think the government has seen now that they have to implement it or they undermine it so much. I think we as political activists need to also start spending some time of just what kind of policies we would like to see now that we can design them again.
I think we should forget about the old distinction between left and right. And I think we should also realize that all the energy, all the dynamic towards Brexit has got a lack of clarity about it. I don't think that Brexit can be understood in terms of the elite, demos dynamic. I don't think there's a relationship there. There's no dynamic there. I think that the important thing to realize is that there has been a certain energy which has come from below, which is often unformed, which is often not articulate, which hasn't got representatives that are genuinely personifying and living those kinds of ideals. And therefore, there is a kind of sense of stasis about how far we go according to the present dynamic. I think Munira is absolutely right that the Brexit debate is a cultural debate. And I think we have to reckon that, and this is the major obstacle we face in this room, is that although we won the vote for Brexit, we didn't win the arguments in the culture war. I think the cultural elites, almost to a person, hate Brexit. They all hate the idea of leaving the EU. the very idea that they think that the high point of civilization is waving an EU flag, I mean, is weird. You know, I mean, nowhere else in Europe, even, you know, France or Germany, people would do stuff like that. They would think they're completely out to lunch if you did anything like that. But there's a kind of cultural impulse which is very rarely challenged, and which in a sense allows for the kind of debasement of political language, which I find almost frightening, where people use language and words towards individuals that are almost, you know, sort of almost unprecedented. You know, we live in a world where you can't offend anybody, right? You can't say, you know, sort of offensive words in universities and elsewhere, but you can offend anybody that's for Brexit. That's clearly not a no-go area. And that was really brought home to me by the exchange of arguments in Parliament this week, where poor old Dennis Skinner, who I think everybody will agree at least has got courage, you know, sort of has got principles, and has kind of withstood the test of time, comes from a mining area with absolutely great working class credentials, gets called a scab by numerous individuals. Just think about it, the word scab applied to Dennis Skinner. And if Dennis Skinner can be called a scab, then you and I are proto-racists, xenophobes, and, you know, we got our brand shirts, you know, sort of on the go. We already ordered on Amazon, you know, sort of. So we have to realize that this is a very big problem for us. There's a culture war that needs to be fought, and the most important. Oh yeah, and one other thing. I think the other problem is that, you know, to be really honest, a lot of the leaders of the Remain, of the Vote Leave campaign, I don't think really believed in Brexit all that much. I mean, they didn't get up in the morning and brush their teeth and say, oh my God, it would be a really nice world once we leave Europe. I think they were playing a political game. Not all of them. We have people like Gisela and a few others, but a lot of them were half-hearted about it, and were often involved in the project of damage limitation. So I think that we have to recognize realities, and I think that the really clear and important thing that we need to be involved in is actually fighting the cultural war for Brexit. And instead of being defensive, instead of being wrong-footed, instead of always sort of apologizing for what we are, we need to occupy the moral high ground. I think that's the first task. We need to say, we are the ones that are moral and good. We are the ones that, you know, sort of are making an important contributions to public life. And you people are so conservative or so defensive that you need to hide entirely behind your privileges, and you need to rely entirely on the language of sneering, of debasing political language, ultimately of being politically dishonest. And I think if we can do that, then at the very least we can keep that energy that led to Brexit going. And I think that's the most that we can aspire to in the medium term. No point talking about the long term, because as somebody once said, we're all dead. But the medium term, there's everything to fight for. And which is why I think we should spend a bit of our time or free time getting involved, getting stuck in, arguing with everybody, arguing with anybody that moves, and making sure that this project realizes its fruition.